The Galactic Council chambers stretched out like a massive dome under the artificial stars of Nexus Prime. 300 years had passed since the last major war, and the representatives from dozens of worlds gathered here every month to discuss trade routes, mining rights, and the occasional border dispute. It was all very civilized, very peaceful, very boring. Ambassador Veltar from the Nexari delegation was talking about shipping schedules again. His forearms gestured gracefully as he spoke, his translator turning his musical clicks into words everyone could understand. The other delegates nodded politely, some taking notes, others clearly fighting off sleep. In the far corner of the chamber sat a small observation booth that most delegates had forgotten existed. The human section. It was dusty from disuse, and today only one person occupied it. Commander Lee Min-ho sat quietly, his weathered hands folded in his lap, watching the proceedings with patient eyes. "The humans," whispered Councillor Thex too, her aide glancing toward the lonely figure. "Do they even matter anymore? Some say they've gone backward, lost their technology, maybe even forgotten how to build starships." Her aide shrugged. "My grandfather used to tell stories about human warriors, but that was centuries ago. Look at him. He just sits there saying nothing." What they didn't know was that Lee Min-ho heard every word. His earpiece picked up conversations from across the chamber, translated them instantly, and filed them away in reports that would reach Earth within hours. He'd been doing this job for 15 years, and in all that time, the galaxy had grown more and more comfortable with the idea that humanity had simply faded away. Through the massive windows of the council chamber, delegates could see the distant stars, including one unremarkable yellow dot that most had forgotten was Earth. Around that dot, if you looked carefully with the right instruments, you could make out a ring of ancient structures, defense platforms, the history books called them. Relics from humanity's violent past, when they'd fought wars across the galaxy before mysteriously withdrawing 3 centuries ago. Most species assumed those platforms were dead metal, slowly decaying in the vacuum of space. They were wrong. Back, on Earth, deep beneath the Himalayan mountains, Admiral Park Soo-jin reviewed the daily intelligence reports in a command center that could coordinate fleets across the entire galaxy. The walls displayed real-time information from thousands of monitoring stations, trade routes, military movements, and political developments. Humanity had spent 3 centuries not in decline, but in preparation. "The Kithara are moving again," reported Lieutenant Kim Da-eun, her fingers dancing across holographic displays that showed ship movements in real time. "They've taken the Ultros system, and they're massing fleets near the spiral arm." Admiral Park nodded grimly. The Kithara had been a problem for decades, slowly expanding their territory through intimidation and conquest. The Galactic Council kept trying to negotiate with them, apparently believing that aggressive military expansion could be stopped with strongly worded letters. What's the Council's response? Same as always. They're forming a committee to study the situation. Park almost smiled. Almost. "And our people in the field?" Commander Lee reports that most delegates still believe we're a minor power. They have no idea what we're capable of. This was exactly how humanity wanted it. After the devastating wars of their youth, when human fleets had carved through the galaxy, leaving destruction in their wake, they'd made a choice. They'd withdrawn, let the galaxy think they were weak, spent centuries developing new technologies and new strategies. They'd learned to be patient, but patience had its limits. In hidden bases throughout human space, soldiers who'd spent decades as farmers and teachers maintained weapons that could shatter moons. The galaxy thought humanity had grown soft. They thought 3 centuries of peace had turned humanity into pacifists. They were about to learn the difference between choosing peace and being incapable of war. Commander Lee Min-ho stood up in his observation booth, preparing to leave as the council session ended. Several delegates glanced his way, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed pity for the representative of a fallen civilization. If only they knew that every word spoken in this chamber was being analyzed by the most sophisticated intelligence network in galactic history. If only they knew that humanity had spent 3 centuries not forgetting how to wage war, but learning how to wage it better. As Lee walked through the corridors of Nexus Prime, passing representatives from dozens of worlds, he reflected on humanity's greatest achievement. They'd convinced the galaxy that they were harmless, and as long as the galaxy remained peaceful, that would remain true. But the Kithara were testing that peace. Soon, very soon, the galaxy might remember why humanity's name had once been spoken in whispers across 1,000 worlds. The question wasn't whether humanity could still fight. The question was whether the galaxy was ready to see what 3 centuries of preparation had created. The emergency session of the Galactic Council was nothing like the peaceful meetings of the past. Delegates rushed through the corridors of Nexus Prime, their faces showing fear that hadn't been seen in centuries. The massive council chamber buzzed with panicked conversations in dozens of languages, creating a wall of sound that the translators struggled to keep up with. "Order, we must have order," Ambassador Veltar shouted, his forearms waving frantically as he tried to control the chaos. But nobody was listening. Representatives from 7 different species were all trying to speak. At once, their voices overlapping in desperate pleas for help. "The Kithara have blockaded our entire home system," cried the Altarian delegate, her crystalline form flickering with distress. "Our people are starving." "They destroyed our defense fleet in less than 6 hours," added the representative from Vega Colony, his voice shaking. "We had 200 ships, 200. They went through us like we were made of paper." Commander Lee Min-ho sat in his usual spot in the human observation section, but today every eye in the chamber kept glancing his way. For 300 years, humanity had been irrelevant to galactic politics. Now, suddenly, desperate species were looking toward the forgotten corner, where Earth's lone representative sat quietly. The Kithara expansion had accelerated beyond anyone's worst fears. What started as a few border conflicts had become a systematic conquest that was rolling through the galaxy like a dark wave. Their fleets moved with military precision that the peaceful civilizations couldn't match. Worse, they didn't just conquer worlds. They enslaved entire populations and stripped planets bare of resources. "We need to form a combined fleet," suggested Councillor Thex, though her voice lacked conviction. "If we pool our remaining ships together—" "With what?" interrupted the delegate from Kepler 442. "Half our fleets are space dust, and the other half are too scared to leave their home systems. The Kithara have warships we've never seen before, weapons that cut through our shields like they're not even there." The chamber fell into uncomfortable silence. 3 centuries of peace had made the galaxy soft. Most species had reduced their military forces to tiny patrol fleets, focusing instead on trade and exploration. They'd forgotten how to fight wars, and now they were paying the price. Commander Lee Min-ho stood up slowly, and the entire chamber went quiet. He was a tall man with graying hair and calm eyes that had seen more than most people could imagine. When he spoke, his voice carried easily across the vast space. "The Human Defense Coalition offers sanctuary to all peaceful species," he said simply. "We have prepared evacuation protocols and can begin immediate extraction of civilian populations." The silence that followed was deafening. Then the questions started flying. "Evacuation?" Veltar's translator made his disbelief obvious. "Commander, with respect, we need military assistance, not refugee camps. We need warriors who can stand against the Kithara fleets." "How many people are we talking about?" asked another delegate. "There are billions of civilians in the threatened systems. Do you have ships capable of moving that many people?" Lee Min-ho's expression didn't change. "Humanity learned long ago that the best way to win a war is not to fight one. We protect what matters most. Innocent lives. We can begin evacuations immediately." Behind his calm exterior, Lee was already in contact with Earth through his secure implant. Admiral Park Soo-jin was coordinating the largest humanitarian operation in galactic history. Transport ships that had been disguised as cargo haulers for decades were already moving toward threatened systems. Space stations that appeared to be research facilities were preparing to house millions of refugees, but the delegates weren't satisfied with evacuation offers. They wanted soldiers, weapons, fleets that could push back against the Kithara advance. They wanted the legendary human warriors their grandparents had whispered about. "Commander," said the Altarian delegate, her voice desperate, "surely Earth has some military capability left?" The old stories speak of human fleets that could— Stories, Lee interrupted gently. Humanity left that path long ago. We build, we protect, we preserve. We do not wage war. What he didn't tell them was that at that very moment, Captain Choi Hyun-woo was standing in the command center of the Pacific Defense Grid, watching as humanity's true military capability came online for the first time in 3 centuries. Hidden bases throughout human space were activating. Soldiers who'd spent decades living normal lives were reporting for duty. Ships that looked like civilian vessels were revealing weapons systems that would make the Kithara think twice. The galaxy wanted evacuation and protection. Earth was prepared to give them that. But if the Kithara pushed too far, if they crossed certain lines that humanity had drawn in their own minds, the galaxy would discover that 3 centuries of peace hadn't made humanity weak. It had made them patient. And patient predators were the most dangerous kind. As the council session dissolved into arguments about evacuation logistics and refugee placement, Lee Min-ho quietly left his booth. He had work to do. Millions of lives needed saving, and humanity had exactly the tools and experience necessary to save them. The galaxy was about to learn that there were different kinds of strength, and sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was choose not to use your full power, but that choice had limits. The refugee convoy, New Haven, was supposed to be safe. Commander Lee Min-ho had personally guaranteed its protection to the Galactic Council, and Earth's Defense Coalition had assigned 3 escort ships to guide the massive transport vessels through hyperspace. 2 million Altarian civilians were sleeping peacefully in the passenger sections, believing they were finally out of danger. Lieutenant Kim Da-eun was monitoring the convoy's progress from the Pacific Defense Grid when her screen suddenly went red with emergency alerts. The hyperspace signatures disappeared one by one. First the escort ships, then the transports. Within minutes, everything was gone. Her hands shook as she established contact with Admiral Park Soo-jin. "Ma'am, we've lost contact with Convoy New Haven. All ships, all signals. Everything just stopped." The command center, usually humming with quiet efficiency, fell completely silent. 300 years of careful neutrality, of choosing protection over aggression, had led to this moment. Admiral Park's voice was steady when she spoke, but everyone in the room could hear the steel beneath her words. "Get me a full scan of the area. I want to know exactly what happened." The answer came within an hour, delivered by a Kithara message, drone that broadcasted its grim contents across the galaxy. The footage was brutal and deliberate. The refugee ships had been pulled from hyperspace by Kithara gravity mines, then systematically destroyed. But they hadn't just been attacked, they'd been executed. Captain Choi Hyun-woo watched the recordings with growing horror. The Kithara hadn't targeted the engines or weapons systems first. They'd gone straight for the civilian quarters, making sure the helpless passengers died before anyone else. The escort ships, with their 18 human crew members, had been saved for last, forced to watch the massacre before being vaporized themselves. "They wanted us to see this," he said quietly to Admiral Park. "This wasn't just an attack. This was a message. The message was clear. The Kithara didn't just conquer worlds, they eliminated anyone who tried to help their enemies. Refugees, aid workers, peacekeepers, everyone was a target. They'd crossed a line that humanity had hoped never to see crossed again." Admiral Park closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them, something fundamental had changed. The weight of 3 centuries of restraint was lifting from her shoulders, replaced by the cold calculation that had once made human fleets the most feared force in the galaxy. "Signal all hidden assets," she ordered. "Activate Protocol 7. Across human space, dormant systems that had waited patiently for 300 years suddenly came alive. On farming worlds, barn doors slid open to reveal shipyards that could build dreadnoughts. In research stations studying peaceful technologies, weapons laboratories began their final preparations. Men and women who'd spent decades as teachers, doctors, and engineers reported to duty stations they'd hoped never to use. The transformation was invisible to outside observers, but devastating in its scope. Humanity had spent 3 centuries preparing for this moment, and every preparation was now being put into motion. Colonel ThemHFY stood on the bridge of what the galaxy knew as the research vessel, Soul's Promise. Her crew had spent 15 years pretending to study asteroid compositions while actually monitoring Kithara fleet movements. Now, as the ship's disguised hull retracted to reveal weapon systems that could crack planets, she felt a familiar mixture of regret and determination. "Target analysis complete," reported Major Bei Sung-min from his tactical station. "The Kithara have spread their forces across 53 systems. Their main battle fleet is currently in the Kepler 442 system, finishing their conquest of the colonies there." ThemHFY studied the tactical display. 3,000 Kithara ships, armed with weapons that had easily crushed every galactic defense force they'd encountered. By any conventional measure, they were unstoppable. But humanity had stopped thinking. Conventionally, 3 centuries ago. "Orders from Admiral Park?" she asked. "Full engagement authorization. No restrictions on force deployment." The Admiral's exact words were, "Show them what we learned during the long peace." The bridge crew exchanged looks. They'd all grown up hearing stories about the old days, when human fleets had carved through the galaxy like avenging angels. But those were stories from a more brutal time, when humanity had been young and angry and careless with power. Now they were older, wiser, and infinitely more dangerous. "Signal the fleet," ThemHFY ordered. "All ships drop concealment protocols. It's time to remind the galaxy why humanity chose to sleep instead of hunt." Across the galaxy, ships that had masqueraded as cargo haulers, research vessels, and mining platforms suddenly revealed their true nature. The Soul's Promise was just one of over 800 vessels that had been hiding in plain sight for decades. Each one was equipped with weapons and defense systems that incorporated 3 centuries of advancement beyond anything the galaxy had seen. But the ships were just the beginning. Major Bei's Cyber Warfare Division had already begun their assault on Kithara communications networks. Captain Lee So-young's special forces were boarding enemy vessels while they were still in hyperspace, and Admiral Park herself was coordinating an operation that would demonstrate the difference between wanting to fight and knowing how to fight. The Kithara had made a fatal mistake. They'd assumed that because humanity chose peace, humanity had forgotten war. They were about to learn that forgetting and choosing were very different things, and they were about to discover what happened when you murdered the people humanity had promised to protect. The Kithara War lasted exactly 73 days, but it felt like watching a master craftsman at work rather than a traditional battle. What the galaxy witnessed wasn't the brutal slugfest they expected, but something far more terrifying, war elevated to an art form. Day 1 began with silence. Every Kithara military base across 50 systems simply stopped communicating with their fleets. No explosions, no battles, no obvious attacks. One moment the Kithara command structure was coordinating the conquest of a dozen worlds. The next moment it was gone. Major Bei Sung-min had spent 30 years studying alien computer systems while pretending to be a university professor. His Cyber Warfare Division didn't destroy the Kithara networks. They took them over. Within hours, Kithara ships were receiving false orders, supply convoys were being redirected to empty space, and their generals were getting completely wrong information about human fleet positions. "It's like watching someone conduct an orchestra," Admiral Park observed from her command center deep beneath the Pacific. "Every move creates the setup for the next move." The Kithara didn't even realize they were under attack until day 3, when their most aggressive commanders started disappearing. Admiral Krax was in his private quarters on the flagship Devourer when his door simply opened and Captain Lee So-young walked in, flanked by 2 human soldiers who seemed to have materialized from thin air. "How did you get on my ship?" Krax demanded, his massive reptilian form towering over the humans. "We're in hyperspace. Nothing can board a ship in hyperspace." Captain Lee smiled politely. "Would you prefer to surrender here, or would you like us to escort you to the bridge so you can surrender in front of your crew?" Similar scenes played out across the Kithara fleet. Commanders who'd seemed untouchable found themselves facing human special forces who appeared and disappeared like ghosts. These weren't random attacks. Each capture was precisely timed to create maximum confusion in the enemy ranks. By day 7, the Kithara military was in complete disarray. Their communication networks were compromised, their leadership was missing, and they were receiving reports of human fleets that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. The first major battle didn't happen until day 23, and it took place in the Vega system, where the Cathara had gathered their largest remaining fleet. 300 warships, including their newest dreadnoughts, faced what appeared to be a much smaller human force. Colonel Nam Ji-hee stood on the bridge of the Soul's Fury, watching as her tactical display showed the enemy formation. The Cathara had arranged themselves in a classic battle formation, expecting a traditional fleet engagement. "They still don't understand," she said to her tactical officer. "They think this is about firepower." The battle lasted 4 hours, and not a single human ship was lost. The Cathara discovered that their weapons couldn't lock onto human vessels that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. Their shields, designed to stop conventional energy weapons, were useless against human systems that bypassed them entirely. But the most shocking part wasn't the technology, it was the restraint. Human forces targeted weapon systems, engines, and communication arrays with surgical precision. They disabled rather than destroyed, captured rather than killed. When Cathara ships surrendered, human medical teams immediately began treating the wounded. Admiral Krax, now a prisoner aboard the Soul's Fury, watched the battle with something approaching awe. "I don't understand," he told Colonel Nam. "You could have destroyed us all in minutes. Why didn't you?" "Because," Nam replied calmly, "we're not trying to become monsters. We're trying to stop them." This was the pattern that emerged over the 73 days of conflict. Human forces would appear suddenly, disable enemy capabilities with minimal casualties, and then disappear just as quickly. They moved through Cathara space like surgeons, cutting out the ability to wage war while leaving everything else intact. The psychological impact was devastating. Cathara soldiers began surrendering before fights even started. Entire fleets defected when they realized they were fighting an enemy that could have killed them all, but chose not to. The Cathara's reputation for unstoppable conquest crumbled, as word spread that there was a force in the galaxy that made them look like children playing with toys. Captain Choi Hyunwoo, coordinating supply lines from his hidden base, marveled at the efficiency of it all. "We're not just winning battles," he reported to Admiral Park. "We're ending their ability to think of themselves as conquerors." By day 50, organized Cathara resistance had collapsed. Their government was in chaos, their military had largely surrendered, and their war criminals were being processed through tribunals that somehow managed to be both swift and fair. The final engagement came on day 73, when the last Cathara holdouts made a desperate attack on a human medical station, treating wounded prisoners. It was over in 20 minutes. The attack force was disabled, and its crews were in human medical care before most of them realized what had happened. Admiral Park stood in her command center, watching as reports came in from across the former Cathara territory. Not one civilian population had been harmed in the liberation. Not one world had been damaged beyond repair. The Cathara military machine had been dismantled with the precision of a watchmaker taking apart a clock. "The galaxy is going to ask how we did it," Captain Choi observed. Park nodded. "And we'll tell them the truth. We spent 3 centuries learning that the best way to win a war is to make it impossible for your enemy to want to keep fighting." The Cathara War was over, but its real lesson was just beginning to sink in across the galaxy. The signing ceremony for the Terran Accords took place on Luna Station, humanity's oldest space facility orbiting Earth's moon. Representatives from every major civilization in the galaxy had come to witness what many were calling the most important treaty in galactic history. Through the station's massive observation windows, Earth hung like a blue jewel against the black of space, looking peaceful and innocent. Admiral Park Soo-jin walked through the corridors of Luna Station, past delegates who stepped aside with a mixture of respect and fear. 3 months ago, most of these beings had considered humanity a minor, forgotten power. Now they spoke in hushed tones about the species that had dismantled the Cathara war machine without breaking a sweat. "The human fleet positions," whispered Ambassador Veltar to his aide as they watched Admiral Park pass. "Do we know where they are now?" "That's just it," his aide replied nervously. "We don't. Most of their ships just disappeared after the war ended. Intelligence suggests they're still out there, but nobody knows where. This was exactly the impression humanity wanted to create. Captain Choi Hyun-woo sat in the command center of what appeared to be a simple research station in the Veil Nebula, watching sensor data that told him everything happening within 50 light years. His station was one of dozens scattered throughout the galaxy, invisible to most scans, but perfectly positioned to monitor everything. The ceremony began with Admiral Park taking the podium in the main conference hall. She wore a simple uniform with no decorations, no ribbons, no symbols of conquest. Behind her, a holographic display showed the new galactic map. Kithara territory had been redistributed to the species they'd conquered, war criminals were facing justice, and trade routes were already reopening. The Human Defense Coalition hereby establishes the following protocols, Admiral Park announced, her voice carrying easily through the vast hall. Any species engaging in systematic warfare against civilian populations will face immediate intervention. Any government committing acts of genocide will be removed from power. Any military force threatening peaceful worlds will be neutralized. The silence in the hall was complete. Every delegate understood they were hearing not just treaty terms, but a promise backed by the most effective military force the galaxy had ever seen. Commander Lee Min-ho, now promoted to Earth's primary diplomatic representative, stepped forward to address the practical concerns. The Galactic Council will continue to govern trade, exploration, and diplomatic relations, he said with a gentle smile. Humanity has no desire to rule the galaxy. We simply insist that others not destroy it. Ambassador Veltar raised one of his 4 hands tentatively. And if there are disputes between member species, border conflicts, resource disagreements, then you'll resolve them through negotiation, as civilized beings should, Lee replied. The galaxy managed 3 centuries of relative peace before humanity withdrew. We have confidence you can do so again. What he didn't mention was the extensive monitoring network humanity had built during those 3 centuries. Lieutenant Kim Da-eun, now coordinating intelligence from Earth, could track every military movement, every political development, every potential conflict before it started. Humanity would know about problems long before they became wars. The ceremony continued. The human fleet began its withdrawal. Transport ships that had carried refugees back to their liberated homeworlds returned to Earth space. Warships that had spent decades disguised as civilian vessels resumed their false identities. The galaxy watched as humanity's visible military presence simply faded away. But careful observers noticed that some ships didn't return to Earth. They vanished into the deep space between systems, their destinations unknown. Captain Lee So-young's Special Forces units seemed to have disappeared entirely, though intelligence services across the galaxy suspected they were still out there, watching and waiting. Colonel Nam Ji-hai stood on the bridge of the Soul's Fury, now stripped of its military markings and redesignated as the research vessel Soul's Promise. Her crew had returned to their cover identities as scientists and researchers, but their weapons systems remained hidden beneath false hulls. "Think they learned their lesson?" asked Major Bae Sung-min, watching as trade convoys began moving through formerly contested space. "For now," Nam replied. "The galaxy has a short memory, but we have a long one." This was humanity's new strategy. They would remain hidden, watching from the shadows, intervening only when absolutely necessary. The galaxy could go back to its peaceful existence, knowing that somewhere out there patient guardians were making sure the peace lasted. On Earth, Admiral Park reviewed the final reports from the Kithara campaign. 0 civilian casualties during the liberation. Full reconstruction aid provided to damaged worlds. War criminals processed through fair trials. It had been a textbook example of how to end a war without creating the seeds of the next one. Lieutenant. Commander Yoon Seo-jin entered Park's office with the daily intelligence summary. "The galaxy's settling back into normal patterns," she reported. "Trade is up, military build-ups are down, and most species seem genuinely committed to the Accords." "Good," Park said, but her eyes remained on the strategic displays showing humanity's hidden monitoring posts. "And our watchers? In position and undetected. If anyone tries to start another war, we'll know about it before they do. As night fell over Earth's Pacific Command Center, Admiral Park looked out at the stars through the facility's observation deck. Somewhere out there, humanity's children, the refugees they'd saved, the worlds they'd liberated, the civilizations. They'd protected us, were building new lives in peace. It was what humanity had always wanted. Not conquest, not domination, but simply the chance for intelligent life to flourish without fear. They'd proven once again that the greatest victory was never having to fight at all, but they remained ready, always ready. Because some lessons, once learned, should never be forgotten. The galaxy slept peacefully, protected by guardians who dreamed of nothing but continued peace, but who were prepared for the nightmare of war if anyone was foolish enough to wake them again.